consistently loud.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
All right. Sorry. Can you hear me now? Is that
yeah,
good? Okay. All right. Sorry, man. So the difference between the proletariat and the peasantry. Now, this is like the peasantry is based in agriculture, right? And the proletariat, I guess, is more a pure type of working man. Could you just sort of clarify that for me?
yeah. So
Yeah.
historically, now I've actually wrote about this in the. It's such a shame. I need to change the title of this Substack because I made a Substack called "On the Pat Sox Split," and it's like
Right.
a dumb title because most people think the Pat Sox Split is just about some internet drama, but only like 5% of it is about the drama. 95% of that Substack is it's an extremely dense, very theoretically wealthy text
Yeah.
explaining things like this, right? Going through things like this. But in that text, so historically, the peasant is typically defined as, yes, agrarian, but the significance of the agrarian has to do with the following, right?
Okay.
One, the sale of the product of working the land is, as Marx pointed out, typically defined by the quality, things like the quality of the land and the soil in relation to rent. So it's almost like a bizarre real estate problem. The price of agricultural product is not necessarily determined. That value doesn't necessarily come from the labor. It comes from some kind of uh,
Like fertility of the soil?
what?
Like a fertility of the
Yes, the
soil?
productivity of the soil. It's a
Yeah.
fixed
Okay.
kind of constant that, sorry, it's a variable constant, but in the soil, not in the labor.
Right. Okay. Yeah,
Because
that
the
does make
food is
sense.
typical,
Okay.
the price of the food, it's typically the form of labor the peasant is engaging in is dependent on a variable that is outside of the control of man in general. That's the most
Okay.
important part, right?
Okay.
Forces
Okay.
of
Yeah.
production, that's dependent on the control of man when the technical forces of production. But the land is completely different. It's almost more kind of in line with the ecological perspective of like, this is
Yeah.
nature, it's not in our control. Then you
So,
have the significance
oh,
of rent, which has to do with the relation of the productivity of the soil and the regularity that comes with that, with a form of rent based on that. Is this land productive? Well, that's going to determine how much one will pay to a landowner in rent, right? So the landowners are parasitic in relation to this in general,
okay.
right? So
Yeah.
really, it's based in ownership of the land. Um, Now, the peasant is typically defined as such for that reason, and also for the fact that their way of life is typically one of subsistence. In the same way that the fertility and the productivity of the soil acquires some kind of regularity that is transformed into a form of rent, so too is their way of life, rather than some kind of completely alienated uh, separation between labor and the means of production, somehow forms a coherent whole, one way of life that possesses some kind of regularity that unites labor with the means of production, and therefore can be qualified as a form of subsistence. The peasant doesn't just refer to a specific form of labor, agricultural labor. It doesn't just refer to a specific form of means of production or the ownership thereof. It refers to a specific form of subsistence, right? And that
Yeah.
is what defines so uniquely the nature of the peasant. That's why peasants are not necessarily proletarian, they're not necessarily petty bourgeois, and they're not necessarily bourgeois. Lenin, in his work on the development of capitalism in Russia analyzes the emergence of these different class categories as virtual orientations within the peasantry. But overall, the peasantry is defined by this general form of subsistence rather than accumulation, I should add, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, okay, that's really great.
Yeah,
This is all recorded, so I'll just come back to it when I start
yeah.
reading for real.
So, okay.
Other question was but yeah, sorry, I know it sounds like I'm
I
dismissing you,
have
but
to
that was
emphasize again another
yeah.
thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
The proletarian is not a form of subsistence. The working class is not defined by a specific form of subsistence. The working class is defined by the sale of labor,
Right.
right? The proletarian is defined by the sale, those who have nothing typically but their labor to sell.
Yeah, yeah.
That was the mantra. Their labor in particular is the productive labor in relation to the forces of production. Now,
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
happened in history, and I emphasize this very strongly in the Patsock split, is there was a fusion of some kind that took place, such that the working class took on a definitive form of subsistence because of the rise of the managerial kind of socialistic state, which also established specific use value of necessity as an economic variable and something guiding the economy. Like the managerial and regulative state establishes a specific way of life for all, the American dream, if you want, the middle class. It establishes some kind of regulatory relationship to the economy that establishes definitive entitlements, rights, regulations, and bureaucracy in relation to the worker. So the worker is no longer some completely abstract, kind of alienated subject just selling their labor at the factory, their labor power in return for a wage in this cold mechanical interaction. The element of subsistence is also established by this new kind of New Deal or welfare state, um, which basically creates what I call the Mecca proletariat, right? And that's what the Mecca is, the form of subsistence that augments the labor power of the worker, a means of production, if you will, augmenting their labor power.
Right. It's kind of like a I guess we're going back to this again, but it's like a new form of peasantry. Is that the idea here?
Yes, well,
Yeah, right.
specifically, it's not even just a new form of the peasantry, it's how the working class has evolved in such a way to replace what used to only be for the peasantry. So there's a
Okay.
kind of fusion between the proletariat and the peasantry. It's not fully a peasantry, but it's not just a pure English factory proletariat. It's some
Right.
kind of unity of the worker and peasant that wasn't just accomplished in Lenin's uh, revolution, but also in material reality in the world in general.
Okay. So could you then explain because we still have farm workers, right? We still have
Yes.
agricultural
So
workers,
farm
right? So
migrant, yeah. So farm workers, such as migrant workers,
yeah, yeah.
that because the migrant workers are not citizens of America, that is like a modern day form of slavery, really, because
Right.
they have no rights, they have no entitlements, they have no uh, regulations, basically. So it's basically a form of the excesses of the barbaric kind of capitalist system, the remnants of it at least, that still exist, or of neoliberalism, if you want. A lot of people try to glorify migrant labor as somehow the epitome of the proletarian position because of how oppressed and marginalized it is. But the truth is,
Suffering
the
all that.
proletarian position was always this thing that was national in form. It was circumstantially an existential problem that was national in form. And that was somehow resolved, partially at least, with the rise of the regulatory state. So the fact that there is this class of migrant workers and foreigners. Give me 1 second. You want to be in it, or?
When you do the reaction to the video.
Okay. Nadia's here, so sorry.
Yeah, it's all right.
So the fact that there has emerged this class of people, migrants, immigrants, refugees, that have no rights, no regulations, it doesn't mean it's a return of the older proletariat. It means it's because the proletariat today is it is irreversibly a mecha proletariat defined by a specific national form. In Mexico, or even any of the countries these migrants come from, within their own country, there is no pure proletariat. It's still some entitlement by the state economically, however small, right? It's not just a Wild West of everyone's just a pure proletarianized subject. So the phenomena of migrant work and refugees being literally, it's a form of exploitation. Not in the Marxist sense, by the way.
Okay.
In a literal sense, exploitation. Like this, they're actually exploiting people in a way that is similar to like slavery or human trafficking. Now, farm workers, you mean farmers who own their own land? I have tried to analyze the Dutch farmers, and I called them the exo-peasantry, because they remain peasants who have somehow augmented their form of subsistence with machinery and tools, which they rent out. So that's the significance of rent. They're indebted by their ownership of these tools. Now, where the exo-peasantry begins and the mecha proletariat ends, it's not exactly certain, right?
Okay.
But that is so far has been my analysis of that.